let's hear from Laurie, whose research on group processes and teams will help us imagine some of the ways in which science communication can be more collaborative.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I guess the most interesting thing about me right now is that I'm interim provost, and I'm going to be talking about conflict and working in interdisciplinary teams, and what I tell all my colleagues is I am practicing what I preach. So I want to share some of my research and think about how it relates to communicating across boundaries. And I left my notes at my chair, and now I'm going to go grab them. I know I had something. All right, which I probably won't look at, but it's comfortable. Okay, research teams. So research is being increasingly done in teams, and research teams are increasingly interdisciplinary. We heard a lot of that in the morning session in talking about how do we communicate across boundaries, how do we think about the interdisciplinarity, how is it funded, and so on. So my research focuses on the dynamics in teams, and I've studied interdisciplinary design teams, product development teams, project teams, research teams. Currently I'm working with colleagues studying intensive care unit teams, and so I'm going to pull some examples from the current work right now. What I'm going to talk about today also is going to make a lot of sense. And I hope it does, or our realities diverge from our experiences. But I want to differentiate that from common sense and making sense. So this will make sense, but it's not necessarily common practice. And I think the challenge we face in any interdisciplinary setting is how to work with one another and bridge our gaps. Communicating science effectively also requires working across boundaries. And when we think about collaborations between practitioners and communicators and research teams and audiences, we're really always crossing boundaries. We're trying to think about our perspective vis-a-vis someone else's, and how do we form these partnerships in a way to more effectively do what we need to do, whether it's innovate, communicate, or move the bar. Okay, so I'm going to address two fundamental questions today. The first one is, how does interdisciplinarity influence our ability to successfully work together? And then the second question is, what can we do to bridge our differences and most effectively communicate with one another? So first I'm going to focus on the impact of interdisciplinarity and then think about how we can bridge. Certainly interdisciplinary collaborations are challenging. We come at the problem from very different perspectives, which the literature talks about in terms of different thought worlds, and it colors the way we view the world. That results in very different understandings of problems. So by looking at a situation differently, we have a different cognitive representation, and we therefore interpret the situation differently and come up with different types of solutions. But this will also result in difficulties in understanding one another, communicating with one another, and bridging the gaps in terms of what do we think is important, how are we going to reach agreements. And if not managed appropriately, it can lead to ineffective collaboration and conflict. So what I want to do is touch on each of these points today, focusing on research on perceptual, or the literature I call it representational gaps, looking at bridging these differences in terms of cognitive and affective integration, and finally looking specifically at conflict expression as a way to increase the likelihood that our disagreements will be more effective. So as we think about thought world diversity, it's really our perspectives come from our backgrounds, our experiences, our training, our culture. And earlier today there was a mention talking about value systems, and when we have conflicts over things where we have deeply held values, it's very challenging in order to resolve. So this thought world diversity is by design built into our teams, right? We want to work with people who come from different perspectives, but that leads to challenges. Because, again, I mentioned this problem definition. We have these perceptual gaps. And what I want to do is give an example from some of the ICU teams we're working with in terms of what this looks like. So imagine, and actually I phoned my colleague who is an ICU doc, and I said, give me a good example of a representational gap or perceptual gap. He gave me one that was so jargon-filled, I couldn't even make sense of it in the paragraph of the email, so I threw that one away. And then he gave me another one that was focusing on end-of-life decisions between intensivists and oncologists, and I felt that was a little too depressing, so I wasn't going to talk about that one. So instead I'm going to talk, again, ICU is a pretty serious place, and we can imagine a situation where we have a patient who's on life support and being cared by a team, and we have nurses both, and as well as physicians caring for the patient. A nurse will walk in with a goal of symptom management, trying to help the patient experience less pain, less agitation, and that will guide the nurse's decision-making in terms of how to proceed. Physician comes in contrast, focusing on treatment of the disease, and they're very focused on the goal of, say, reducing reliance on a respirator. And when you have these two goals, they're different, right? It really has a very different definition of what it means for a patient to be improving, right? Is this about comfort? Is it about reliance on a respirator? This will lead to disagreements. It will lead to missed messages to the family about what should be done and how this person should be treated, and can affect the quality of coordination and decision-making. So this is a great example of a gap, because they're coming from different perspectives with different goals in mind. So next I want to focus on how we bridge these gaps that are built into our interdisciplinary teams. And I'll talk about it in two methods. One is thinking about cognitive integration, which is how we think and what we understand, and the other I'll talk about is affective integration, or how we feel about one another. So cognitive integration focuses on developing understanding of one another's perspective. And it can be through understanding the jargon that you use, your ways of reasoning, your goals and constraints. The idea is I don't have to know what you know, but I have to understand how you come at a problem so we can work together. When I was doing some research in a continuing care facility, we were trying to improve the cognitive integration of the top management team. They were experiencing conflict, so we first identified where the gaps, the rubbing points were. We took members of the top management team and we sent them out to lunch with each other with a questionnaire. Basic stuff, to understand one another's jobs. Then they all came back, reported to the top management team, which increased the understanding. They shadowed each other for a half a day to follow. What is your day like? What are your constraints? What are the challenges that you're facing? So this is in line with stepping in someone else's shoes. That seemed to help, and it did help, both objectively and qualitatively in terms of increasing collaboration and their understanding of one another. The second arena in bridging gaps focuses on how we feel about one another. And this hopefully makes sense, right, in terms of the domains. Where is it important? So the first is in terms of trust. Okay, do I trust you? Can I rely on you? And this is typically gained through expertise and reputation. The second category is respect. Okay, do I hold you in high regard? Do I value your expertise? Do I value what you bring to the table? And the third category is liking. Do I want to spend time with this person? Do I want to socialize with you? And we get this through shared friends and opportunities to work together. Now, this seems pretty obvious. These are important. But what becomes very interesting in this setting is that they don't always co-vary. In other words, you can have a situation where you trust someone, but you don't respect them. Think about a lackey. Or you respect someone, but you don't trust them. Think about your competitor, right? Someone you hold in high regard, but you wouldn't rely on them. They don't hold they're not benevolent. So it's this combination that really helps people listen to one another. If I value what you're bringing to the table, if I trust you to be honest, and if I enjoy spending time with you, and I'll talk about that in a second, we're more likely to listen to one another, to integrate the information that one another shares. One thing I want to say about liking is when I teach my MBA students who are younger, they typically say, well, liking isn't as important. It's a bonus, but it's not that important. And I say, well, what happens if you don't like someone on your team? And what they come to pretty quickly is, well, I don't want to spend time with them, I avoid them. And I say it's very difficult to get your work done if you don't want to be in the same room with the other people. So all of these aspects are important to help bridge gaps through the affective integration piece. And of course, there's a relationship between how I look, how I feel, and about you, and how if I'm willing to integrate the information you provide to me. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about today is this issue of collaboration and conflict. Now, interdisciplinary collaborations are challenging. We all know that. And largely because they generate conflict. And the big question is that we face in the literature and studied ad nauseum is conflict good or bad for teams? Right? The positive story is it's great. You surface all the disagreements. You can innovate. And in fact, the literature does support the ideas that teams that have more conflict are more likely to be innovative. But this conflict also disrupts productivity and the ability to listen to one another. And so what's key to this is how the conflict is expressed. And there's a lot of literature in negotiation and conflict management that we can pull under this umbrella or rubric of conflict expression. And there's basically two dimensions in how we think about how we express conflict to one another. So one is this area of directness. So am I being explicit and clear with you about my position and why I disagree with you? And the second dimension is oppositional intensity, or what is the degree of force with which I'm conveying my disagreement. So as you can imagine, these two things can vary independently, and they do. And if we combine them, we can really look at 4 general categories of conflict expression. So I'm going to talk about those briefly, but I'm guessing you know where I'm going to end up. So in situations where you have very direct and intense expressions of opposition, those are your arguments, right? Where we're pretty clear about what we're disagreeing about, but it's communicated in such a way that emotions are triggered, information may become biased, we stop listening to the other side because we're trying to defend our own position. So we can think about arguments, and we can think back in teams you've worked, and what are the situations under which your disagreements have led to arguments. The second category, if we pull down the directness but keep the intensity, these are undermining behaviors. And undermining behaviors are really interesting because there's lots of ways we can undermine someone else. So we can dismiss what they have to say. We can discount them or exclude them. We can complain about them and denigrate them to others. We can backstab. And the most interesting, in my mind, is teasing. Right? So think about groups you've been in where there's a lot of teasing. There's 2 ways teasing can go. One is it can be a way to pull someone in to say, I'm comfortable enough with you that I can make a joke at your expense, and you'll feel good about it, and it's fine. We did a study of EMT teams, emergency medical technicians, and teasing was positively related to the cohesion in the group. On the other hand, teasing can be used to undermine another party, make them feel worse about themselves, they're more subversive. And we have, in another organization I studied in this continuing care facility, teasing was negatively related with team cohesion. It was really a way to exclude others. And so I think that what happens here in undermining is in indirect communication is that it's very ambiguous what the meaning is. And so the interpretation differs depending on the relationship. The third category is disguising behaviors. So these are very low intensity and very direct. And they're so subtle that people may not be sure what's going on. Are you dissing me? You didn't show up to the meeting again. You came late again. You didn't respond to my email. And there's a vague sense of opposition, but the recipient questions their own interpretation of the behavior, which can lead to fear and uncertainty and a lot of stress. Finally, we have situations where the intensity is pulled back, but the directness is high. And this is, the gold standard. These are the debates, the deliberation, the back and forth, where people are not as entrenched in their position. They're able to really move the conversation forward. So with this approach, you can get a sense of debate being a dominant communication style for conflict. You're avoiding conflict spirals, increasing information, and decreasing emotion. And in fact, it decreases the negative emotion. It also increases the positive emotion in terms of energy and excitement. So how can team science inform and advance communication of science. I think there's 3 takeaways: by bridging perceptual gaps via cognitive integration, affective integration, and debate and deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.